everybody, it's Stuart Hillard here, back with another YouTube video for my channel, Stuart Hillard Makes. If you're not already a subscriber and you've just discovered me, hello there, how are you? If you are already a subscriber, thank you. But if you're not, make sure you subscribe and tap the bell icon as well, just to make sure you always get notifications when I've posted a new video. Now, in today's video, we've got a tutorial for my Scrappy 16 patch quilt. So it's a little bit longer project today, but still super easy. And remember, when you're making a quilt, you're just doing it one block at a time. Now, this quilt made completely for free. They were fabrics that I was given. They were little sample pieces of fabric that fabric reps take round to fabric shops to show them what's coming next. And I was given a whole bunch of them. And they were so beautiful, but they were also pretty eclectic. There were lots of different colours, lots of different patterns. And your scraps might look something like that too, very eclectic. And one of the ways that you can make really eclectic scraps work in a quilt is to use something that is uniform. And in this case, it's the shape that we're cutting. So simple squares and a simple 16 patch. So nothing complicated. Is if you've already got sort of complex fabric, putting that then with complex piecing can make the whole thing a bit chaotic. Whereas simple piecing plus complex fabric makes a beautiful quilt. The other thing that I've done here is I've used one really busy fabric, and then I've used one solid fabric for each block. And all I did was I kind of looked at the fabric and picked out one of the colours, more or less, and picked a fabric, a solid fabric that matched up with that. So you can see this gorgeous Tula pink fabric that I've got right here. I could have picked out maybe the turquoise or the apricot, or this sort of deeper red, or the pastel pink. I just picked out the fuchsia. I really like the brightness of that. So what I've got here actually are two 10-inch squares. So this pattern would work really well for a layer cake as well. And from two layer cake squares, one solid, one patterned, you'll get two finished blocks. And the blocks are 8-inch finished. Now, the whole quilt that I've got on the table here is 72 inches square, and it's made out of 8-inch blocks. So I've got 9 rows of 9 blocks. So you'll need to make a total of 81 blocks. There you go, I do maths as well. So what we're going to start with then, I've got my 2 layer cake squares, one patterned, one solid, and I've got them both pretty side up. And I'm going to cut 2.5-inch strips. Now, each set of 2 layer cake squares is enough for 2 blocks. I only want to make 1 block right now, so I'm just going to cut half of my layer cake square, and I'll keep the other one for another time. So what I'm going to do now is lay out my 2.5-inch strips. So these are 2.5 inches by 10 inches, and I'm just going to lay them out so that I've got pattern plain, pattern plain. And my next job is to sew all these strips together. Now, I'm going to need to make sure that the ends are nicely matched up. So often when I'm strip piecing, I won't bother to pin my strips, but in this instance, I'm going to pin them just to be a good boy. I've got my machine set for 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to sew down that long edge. Pins out before you get to them. And in the interest of not wasting thread, I'll get my other strip set ready. So I've got my other plain and pattern strips, right sides together, just match up the ends and pin. And then I'll run that through the sewing machine as well. Once you've got your 2 strip sets done, you're just going to give them a little press. Run your iron along the seam that you've just sewn, just to set the seam. And I'll do that with my second pair of strips. And that just helps all the stitching to kind of bed in into the fabric and tightens it up a little bit. And then what I'm going to do on a flat surface is I've got the plain fabric on top, and I'm going to flip that strip up. And then working from the center out, I'm just going to use my thumbnail to push back quite firmly but without distorting the fabric, to push that fabric back out of the way, kind of telling the fabric which way it needs to go when I take it to the ironing board. And then when I press my seams, I want to make sure that I'm running the iron with the seam that I've just sewn, not against it, because that's how you push sort of curves into your seams. The last step that I need to do is just to join those two pairs together. Just make sure that you've got a patterned and a plain fabric together. So again, I'm going to match the ends and pin it, and 1/4 inch seam. Push it back again. I'm always making sure that I'm pushing my seam allowances to the solid fabric. Now, if you were using very light solid fabrics and darker patterned fabrics, you might want to push your seam allowance towards the patterned fabric, but be consistent with your pressing throughout the whole quilt, and then your blocks will line up with each other really nicely. Okay, so now then I've got a piece of stripy fabric. Hurrah. So what I need to do now, and my ends all match up really nicely, I now need to cut this into 4 2.5 inch segments. Okay, now this is why we needed to make sure that our ends were really nicely lined up. That only matters if you're using a layer cake square, because you've got 10 inches and no more. If you were cutting this from yardage or you had bigger scraps, then you could cut those strips at maybe 10.5 inches, and then you've got a little bit of leeway. You can trim the ends square. So 2.5 inch segments. And I need to cut 4 of them. And now you've got 4 segments that look like this. If you've never done patchwork before or never done this sort of piecing before, this is called strip piecing, because we pieced strips together and now we're cutting it up and we're going to rearrange those pieces rather than cutting lots of squares. So what I'll do next is just turn each alternate strip set around, and then there's the magic. We've now got a checkerboard. Easy job now just to sew them back together again. Now, we were really careful to press our seam allowances in towards the solid fabric all the time. And now, because we've twisted and turned our strip sets around, all of our seam allowances are offset. They're kind of going in opposite directions every time we get to them, which has a couple of benefits. It distributes the bulk, but it also means that there's a sort of point all along the seam where our 2 pieces of fabric are going to lock together. So I like to use that instead of pins. So I will lock my first pair of seams together, stitch as far as that, and then I will move my fabric over so that the next pair of seam allowances are locking together, and then I'll stitch just to that point and then stop, and then go to my next intersection, my next pair of seams, and stitch, and then match up the ends. And then I'll just give that a little set. Always make sure you're pressing your seam in the direction that you sewed it. So there's my half a checkerboard, all nicely matched up. No pins required. And then I'm just going to do exactly the same with the other strip set. I've got 2 halves of my block now. Last step is just to put them right sides together. Again, just make sure that you've got patterned to plain all the way along. Now, I mentioned earlier on that to make my 72 inch finished quilt, you're going to need 81 blocks. This is one of 81 blocks, so you have another 80 blocks to make. But before you start making those other 80 blocks, there's an important step, and that is to measure that first block that you have made. You want to measure it through the center, both ways, and make sure that it measures 8.5 inches from raw edge to raw edge. If it doesn't measure 8.5 inches, now is a really good time to find that out. Rather than when you've made 81 blocks and then you find that they don't measure 8.5 inches in both directions. Maybe they measure 8.5 one way, 8.25 the other. They are not going to fit together. And you're just then going to feel, frustrated because you've made all those blocks. You've used all your fabric and your quilt isn't going to go together nicely. I find that's usually when a quilt project turns into a UFO, an unfinished object. Something usually has gone wrong. If everything measures 8.5 inches both ways, brilliant, make some more. again, I still wouldn't cut out everything to make all remaining 80 blocks. I would maybe cut another 10. I would piece those and I would then measure those. And I like to keep measuring throughout the process just to make sure that at the worst, I might have a few blocks to remake, but I'm never in a position where I've got to start again or just throw the whole thing in a cupboard and eat a big piece of cake. That's just me. Now, if when you measure, you find that it doesn't measure what it's supposed to, there's a couple of things you can look at. One of them is your cutting. Lots of people assume it's always their sewing that's inaccurate. Their seam allowance is too big or too small. But actually, a lot of us don't cut very well. And if you struggle with rotary cutting, maybe look at something like die cutting, the AccuQuilt system, for example, where you can cut really perfect strips and squares and triangles, and you know that the cutting is spot on. The second thing that can go wrong is your sewing. You need an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. And if you're sewing a seam allowance which is too big, then your blocks will turn out too small. So you need to make your seam allowance a little narrower. If your seam allowance is too small, then your blocks are going to be bigger than they're supposed to be. You need to make your seam allowance a little wider. It's good to know that when you've only made one block and not 81. So that's the finished block. All you need now to do is cut and piece the rest, and then you're going to sew them together in 9 long rows of 9 blocks. And on your rows, you want to press the first row with the seam allowances all going one way. And then on the second row, when you join the blocks, all the seam allowances go the other way and go this way and then that way for all of your different rows. And then when you sew your rows together, those seam allowances will also nest and go in opposite directions. Now, I wouldn't try and sew those rows together without pinning. I would pin at those block intersections and in between, just to make sure everything stays nice and accurate. But you will find your quilt top should come together really easily. And then once that's all done, you can layer it and quilt it. Last of all, I want to just look very quickly at how I quilted my quilt. So when I came to actually quilt my Scrappy 16 patch, I wanted to do something that was quick, easy and effective. Now, oftentimes when people make simple patchwork like 9 patch, 16 patch blocks, the sort of default setting for quilting is to use a walking foot and to stitch in the ditch. And stitching in the ditch means sewing really, really close to the seam lines, probably in opposite directions. I think that's really hard to do. I mean, really hard to do, because you're trying to keep your stitching along a seam line, and if you start wobbling, it's really obvious. The other thing that a lot of people would do with a quilt like this is to cross hatch it, and that means sewing from diagonally from corner to corner through all of the squares in both directions. But again, you've got a very obvious start and finish point on every single square that you've got to hit perfectly, otherwise it's really obvious that you didn't. So neither of those options appealed to me. I wanted something easier. So rather than trying to sew straight lines, I sewed wiggly, sort of wavy lines, just gently wiggling, gently undulating. I mean, I always say to people, just try and sew straight. We'll probably wiggle anyway. So it's very gentle. And then rather than following the seam lines, I actually went in between. So right down the middle. So what I did was I started here with a walking foot still and just sewed a gently wiggling line all the way down from one side to the other. And then I cut my threads, turned the quilt around, started from the other way and did the same again. So a gently wiggling line and just kept going like this. Might as well do this one as well while I'm here. There we go, like that. And then I turned the quilt and then I did exactly the same thing, going the other way, obviously from one side of the quilt to the other. And that gave me a really nice texture to my quilt. It was quick, it was easy, It was using a walking foot, which lots of us are comfortable using, but it wasn't trying to sew straight lines. Straight lines are really hard. Gently undulating lines are really easy, so this is successful. The last thing is, in terms of colour for quilting, when you've got so many different colours to try and match up, I used a really nice sort of rich, quite bright golden yellow. Bright pink would have looked good, red would have looked great as well. You know, you can either use a neutral or go for something bright. Just almost pick a colour and just go for it. And I'm sure that you'll be pleased with your results. Well, thanks for joining me for my latest tutorial for my Scrappy 16 patch quilt, which is taken from my book Use Scraps, Sew Blocks, Make 100 Quilts, which was published by Pavilion and is available in all good bookstores and quilt shops and also on Amazon. So look for Use Scraps, Sew Blocks, Make 100 Quilts. The Scrappy 16 patch is quilt number 1. There are 99 more, so plenty to keep you busy. I hope you'll keep coming back and joining me for more tutorials on Stuart Hillard Makes. In the meantime, happy making, happy sewing, and I'll see you next time.